So I think we'll get started, and it'll be a bit of a slow start, so if people take a while to find the room, that all works. My name's Adele Perry, and I'm a settler historian and the director of the Center for Human Rights Research here at the University of Manitoba. And it's my real pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is a seminar by Dr. Youcef Soufi on Islamophobia and Colonial Violence, Solidarity and Civil Resistance in post-9/11 Manitoba. This is a conversation occurring in a particular place, the lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Red River Métis people, guided by the relationships and accountabilities of Treaty 1 and also the Manitoba Act. We drink water from Shoal Lake and Treaty 3, and our hydroelectric power has come from the north and the west, and has come at the real expense of those who live in Treaty 5. And I'm also mindful of the fact that the families of Mercedes Myron and Morgan Harris have asked that land acknowledgement include the recognition that the landfill has yet to be searched for the remains of their loved ones, and that of Mishkode Bizikwe. These histories of dispossession and how Indigenous people and nations have resisted and lived in the teeth of colonialism in these territories have never been separate from practices of colonialism and colonial violence elsewhere. Migrants described as quote-unquote Arabs settled throughout early 20th century Prairie Canada, including near Manitoba's Fort Alexander Reserve. Histories of settler colonialism that remade this place are also remade in other parts of the world, including Palestine. Today's presentation will offer us all a careful window into some of these connections and ties that continue to exist between this part of the world and the politics of colonial violence and Islamophobia. This event has been in the works for some time, before the most recent violations of international human rights law, loss of life and life-sustaining infrastructure in Palestine and Israel, and an associated rise in anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic, anti-Palestine, and anti-Arab racism globally, and here on campus and in our community in Winnipeg. We have compiled a list of resources. Dr. Pauline Tennant and Angela Ciceron in particular have compiled a list of resources that folks might consult as they want to learn more about these events, their ties to colonialism and resistance in North America. And these resources will be available on our website in the days to come. We're enormously lucky today to have as distinguished a scholar as Dr. Youcef Soufi to present with us. He is an alumni of the University of Manitoba. We are very proud of that. He also holds a PhD from the University of Toronto. He's taught at the University of British Columbia and is currently a research associate with the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. Dr. Soufi is an expert in the history of Islamic law, which is the topic of his 2023 book with Oxford University Press. More recently, he has been examining North American Muslim communities' responses to anti-Muslim racism in the aftermath of 9/11. That is the subject of a forthcoming book tentatively entitled On the Outskirts of Empire, Radicalization and State Surveillance on the Canadian Prairies, that will be published with the New York University Press in 2024. And today's talk draws on that work. Dr. Soufi will speak for about 40 minutes.
Actually, it's probably going to be closer to an hour.
Okay, closer to an hour. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for conversation after. So thank you again for coming and to share this space and these ideas with us today. And with all of that, I will turn things over to Youcef Soufi.
Thank you to Adele and Pauline for inviting me. This is my first talk since moving back to Winnipeg, and I'm happy to share my research with friends and former professors. I also want to thank Idris El-Bakri for putting me in contact with the CHRR. Idris is back in East Jerusalem with his family, and my thoughts and prayers are often with him these days. Before beginning, I know that there is an appetite for lectures that provide us with political guidance on the crisis in Gaza. This talk is not about Gaza, Israel, or Palestine, but it nonetheless offers us resources for thinking about continuities between the post-9/11 context of the war on terror and the present ethnic cleansing of Gaza. I'll speak for about an hour, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So let's begin. Islamophobia and colonial violence, nomadic solidarity and civil resistance in post-9/11 Manitoba. It is March 20th, 2004. I'm riding my bicycle to the Manitoba legislature. I look in the horizon and see the crowd of protesters I have come to meet. It is the one-year anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, and although the war itself was met with mass international protests from citizens across the globe, today the group gathered at the legislature is relatively small, perhaps 100 or 200 at most. The march and rally were planned by the No War Coalition, a local leftist organization, but most of the attendees that I see are members of the Winnipeg Muslim community. Among them are long-standing community elders, new immigrants, and a young generation of university students born and raised in Canada. As I join the group, I hear chants to stop the war, end the occupation, and for US President Bush to leave Iraq. But as a Muslim community member speaks, someone in the crowd exclaims, "Takbir," a call asking Muslim listeners to affirm that God is great. It is a reminder that protest and piety are intertwined within Winnipeg's Muslim community. As I listen to the crowd, I wonder if this mobilization matters. I've seen the Muslim community here before, for Palestine and Afghanistan. It is unclear to me that this small group can affect much change. And yet a sense of duty keeps them coming back. As scholars of Islamophobia, such as Belgique Negra, have pointed out, Muslims coming of age in and around 2001, which Yasmin Zine dubs the 9/11 generation, were exceptionally politically minded. They had no choice, really. They were being interpolated by the state, the media, and fellow citizens to represent a faith associated with a foreign enemy during the global war on terror. In effect, this created a generation seeking to change what it considered an unjust state of affairs, at home and abroad, not only through street protests, but also by changing institutional norms, and in particular our legal system, the academy, journalism, and politics. In my talk today, I propose to build upon these insights about the 9/11 generation by arguing that Muslim political mobilization was sustained by an ethics of international Muslim solidarity, which can only be understood if we examine in greater detail the notion of the Ummah, an Arabic term often translated as the global Muslim community. I aim to show that Canadian Muslim solidarity with people suffering under the war on terror depended upon moral exhortations and ethical practices that sought to foster love and care for one's brothers and sisters in distant lands. I use brothers and sisters quite consciously because most Muslims at the time of my research would have spoken about gender in a binary manner. I call this form of mutual care ummatic solidarity, a term I will unpack later. Furthermore, I want to suggest that Canadian Muslims have something to teach us about how to sustain human rights in the absence of strong state institutions. We will recall Hannah Arendt's claim that human rights, as lofty of a discourse as it may be, matter very little for those who do not benefit from the backing of a strong state willing to enforce them. Arendt made these observations in a post-World War II context where stateless refugees had little protection. In saying that Muslims have something to teach us about human rights, the us being citizens of North American liberal democracies, my aim is not to exempt Muslims from scrutiny, but to follow the example of anthropologists of Islam, such as Talal Asad, Amira Mittermeier, and Mayanti Fernando, for whom insights gained from studying maligned and marginalized communities are meant to humble us and to allow for a true dialogue across what Wittgenstein called forms of life. The data I present today is adapted from the second chapter of an upcoming book on Islamophobia. The book uses 3 sources. First, archival materials from the Manitoba Islamic Association, the oldest and largest Sunni Muslim organization in Manitoba. In particular, I make use of the organization's monthly publication entitled the Manitoba Muslim Magazine. Second, autoethnographic data from 1999 to 2007, a period during which I actively participated within the Winnipeg Muslim community. And third, interviews with community members conducted between 2020 and 2021. My talk today can be divided into 4 sections. First, I examine the US and Canadian states' discursive justification for the war on terror. Second, I show how this discursive justification devalued Muslim life abroad. Third, I analyze the notion of the Ummah to understand why the devaluation of Muslim life led to Muslim activism. And fourth, I reflect upon the limits and usefulness of Muslim solidarity in thinking about solidarity with the human in human rights. Section 1, justifying war, the civilized and the savage. Where were you? It is such a common thing to ask. Where were you when the 2 towers collapsed on September the 11th? The question gestures towards the significance of the event in world history. We all knew it was a cataclysmic moment that would change things forever. But for myself, as part of the Muslim minority in North America, the more salient question is, where were you when you first wondered, how will they treat me now? The aftermath of 9/11 highlighted the Muslim citizens' uncertain place within North American society. Within hours following the collapse of the Twin Towers, Osama bin Laden was labeled the prime suspect, and his Muslim extremist faith was identified as the motive for his actions. I was sitting in the chair at my optometrist's office, Dr. Champagne, when I first asked myself this question. It was the afternoon of a sunny Tuesday, a few hours after watching the attacks on a TV in our school library. My mother had picked me up from school early for my annual checkup. As I sat in the optometrist's chair, waiting for the exam to start, I wondered if Dr. Champagne would see me differently. I took comfort in the fact that he had known me since I was a child, and that we belonged to the same French-Canadian community. But I was known as Louis as a child, and my charts said Youcef now. Would he know that was an Arab name? When Dr. Champagne came in, he greeted me warmly. "Today's a crazy day, isn't it?" "Yes, it sure is," I answered. He added, "The world's going to be different tomorrow." "That's for sure." I scanned his tone and countenance for anything anomalous. Nope, I could tell he saw me as he always had. A longtime patient, a fellow community member, and most of all, a regular person. I had never been so relieved to be ordinary. Though I began to breathe more easily as a Canadian Muslim, my position within the nation would remain in flux for several days. During these days, mosques were vandalized and hate crimes against Muslims proliferated. A mosque in Montreal was even firebombed. When the state eventually defined my place, along with my co-religionists, within the nation, it was part of a broader evolving narrative that pitted allies against enemies. The impact of this narrative would exceed my small Winnipeg community and end up shaping world politics in lasting ways. The vision of a Western civilization under siege was at the heart of this narrative. Following the US's lead, the Canadian state articulated this vision concretely and officially on Monday, September 17th, 6 days after 9/11. Once we examine this vision, we will better understand what many Canadian Muslims found troubling about it. Canadian political leaders gathered in the House of Commons. Jean Chrétien, the long-standing Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party, began by presenting the following motion: that this House express its sorrow and horror at the senseless and vicious attack on the United States of America on September 11th, 2001. That it express its heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims and to the American people, and that it reaffirm its commitment to the human values of free and democratic society and its determination to bring justice to the perpetrators of this attack on these values and to defend civilization from any future terrorist attack. A central theme of the PM's motion was that the 9/11 attacks threatened not only the US, but all civilized nations. Chrétien reiterated this position throughout his address, stating, quote, "In the sad and trying days since the awful news came from New York and Washington, it has been clear that the civilized nations of the world have a solemn duty to speak as one against the scourge of terrorism." Other party leaders followed suit. The leader of the official opposition, Stockwell Day, affirmed last week's horrific attacks in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania have shocked everyone in the civilized world. And the progressive conservative leader and former Prime Minister Joe Clark stated, "We must organize ourselves to protect and assert the civilized values that were so deliberately attacked." No nation has a greater stake in that response than Canada, and we must play our full part. But we must ask ourselves, if September 11th was an attack against civilized nations, then who exactly were these nations? And equally important, who were the uncivilized or the savages? Historicizing the term civilization is useful here. To invoke civilization, as these political leaders did, is to tap into a broader colonial history, demarcating the West from the rest. Since the Enlightenment, civilization has been used to speak of Europe's place on the top of a ladder of human progress. The term was employed to justify military violence and domination in places where people's skin was darker, their noses flatter, or their hair curlier. In the 19th century, the mission civilisatrice became a common way to describe to describe Western Europe's duty to bring their culture to the world. Indeed, it is difficult to historicize the West as a geographically bounded entity without focusing on its nearly obsessive use of the concept of civilization. This is because it was not only colonial officials who used the term to refer condescendingly to those they governed. Rather, Europe's top intellectuals theorized the term itself. J.S. Mill's classic essay, aptly titled Civilization, defined the concept generally to designate any human improvement, but also more narrowly to speak of the improvement that makes civilized nations superior to savages. Mill identified the superiority of civilized nations in their power, wealth, arts, and sciences. He located the root of this superiority in the social cooperation that characterizes civilized nations. Among savages, every man is for himself, relying on his own physical strength and cunning, supplemented at most by his family or tribal affiliations. In contrast, individuals of civilized nations cooperate for the general benefit of the collective. The result is material and intellectual progress. Thus, in speaking of civilized nations, Canadian leaders were inevitably reappropriating old violent and boundary-defining imaginaries. In Canada, the language of civilization was used to justify residential schools, Shortly after Confederation, Canadian leaders spoke of civilizing Indigenous peoples by stripping them of their language, culture, and religion. Alexander Morris, a cabinet minister and lieutenant governor of Manitoba, who negotiated several treaties with Indigenous peoples of the prairies, explained in 1880 his hopes for how the schools would shape Indigenous children. Quote, "The new generation can be trained in the habits and ways of civilized life." At the opposite end of civilized Western nations stood Osama bin Laden as the paradigmatic figure of the savage. Stuck in his cave in Afghanistan, he exemplified the medieval religious mentality of primitive peoples, incapable of grasping the higher truths of the modern sciences or appreciating the benefits of refined living. The Taliban, garbed in what appeared to be equally pre-modern attire, partook in savagery by offering bin Laden shelter in their lands. The discourse of the civilized West and savage terrorists placed the figure of the common Muslim, abroad and at home, in a precarious and vulnerable position. Politicians and media portrayed the Muslim in one of two ways. The Muslim was either seen as suspiciously close to the savage by virtue of a common faith. The Muslim male, in particular, became what Junaid Rana characterizes as a figure of fear and apprehension for the West. This portrayal would legitimate US and Canadian surveillance and detention policies in the subsequent decade. Alternatively, the Muslim, and particularly the Muslim woman, as Shireen Razak and Leila Abulorod have shown, was positioned as a victim of savagery, needing to be saved through military intervention. By positioning the global war on terror as one for civilization, the US and its NATO allies were preparing the ground for the long battle ahead. Politicians warned that the battle would not be easy, and military and civilian casualties would have to be stomached. The discursive analysis of the concept of civilization in the weeks after 9/11 reminds us that one of the roles of the state in the modern era is to reimagine the boundaries of the nation to render different political projects possible and forms of violence palatable. This is a point that is of paramount importance when we think about the ethnic cleansing of Gaza today and our own politicians' justifications for this violence. But while the deployment of the discourse of civilization during the War on Terror is well known to many academics, what is less well understood is its impact on Canadian Muslim communities, a point I will pursue in the next two sections by focusing on the Winnipeg Muslim community. Section 2, the ungrievability of Muslim life. The discourse dividing the world between civilized and savage had immense consequences on the value of lost life in the ensuing War on Terror. Judith Butler has invoked the term grievability to speak of the differing worth we accord to life lost in war. I use the term here because it is useful in capturing our striking range of emotions from empathy to apathy for victims of military violence. Part of Butler's argument is that the state mediates and regulates our responses to justify its participation in war. In the War on Terror, the state's discourse on civilization was central to assessing the value of lives lost. To position the West as civilized was already to assert its status as, quote-unquote, the good guys, standing above the moral censure that casualties of war and material destruction might otherwise provoke. Most civilian casualties of the US and NATO military campaigns during the War on Terror went under or unreported. We can use Afghanistan in the early 2000s as an example. After taking control of Afghanistan in 2001, US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called reports of civilian deaths terrorist propaganda, even when the US's newly installed Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, insisted on the contrary. It took until July 2002 for the US media to focus on an incident in which the US caused large-scale civilian deaths. On July 1st, a US gunship bombarded 4 Afghan villages in Uruzgan province. The worst hit was a village named Kahrak, where a wedding party was gathered at the time. Official numbers varied, but at least 40 villagers died, while another 100 were wounded. The story, though, took time to gain traction. The Pentagon initially denied civilian casualties. It was only when Karzai expressed displeasure at reports of the bombing that the US media began to focus on the story, and the US government felt the need to take it seriously. Eventually, the US did apologize, and George Bush even called his ally Karzai to show his contrition. But this change of heart was begrudging, to say the least. After initial denials of the deaths, the Pentagon came out with a repertoire of excuses. It accused the villagers of targeting the gunship. It blamed the Taliban for using the villagers as human shields. And it claimed that reports of casualties had been greatly exaggerated. In their estimation, perhaps only 5 people had died. When the New York Times dug deeper into the story, it was not to identify and mourn the lost lives, but to ascertain the facts of the case. Thus, Afghan villagers who witnessed the bloodshed are named as sources, while the deceased are not. Instead, the deceased are spoken of gruesomely as torsos in a courtyard and detached flesh hanging from a pomegranate tree. The description is meant to provoke disgust, but not sympathy. The dead are an assemblage of body parts, not persons with names, a history, a family, or home. And no charges were ever laid. As an apologetic US Army official told one of the village members, "We're sorry, but what's done cannot be undone." It was time for these villagers to accept their loss and move on. Canadian media reported the tragedy with more care. Some drew a parallel between the US's carelessness in the bombing of Uruzgan and the so-called friendly fire incident in April of that year, where the US mistakenly killed Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan. But for the most part, Afghan casualties remained obscured in our press as well. The US and Canadian response to loss of life is crucial to understanding the Canadian Muslim experience of the War on Terror. Afghan lives were framed only in terms of their political worth. Indeed, Karzai was clear that it would be difficult to govern if the body count of Afghans kept rising. But their passing itself was rarely marked. After all, Afghans were to benefit from our military actions. They would be liberated from their plight at the hands of the Taliban, as an article from the Toronto Star made clear the same week as the Uruzgan bombing. They, alongside other Muslim peoples, were victims of their dictatorial regimes and were waiting to be freed by our military and or its allies. Devoid of civilizational purpose, Afghans and other Muslim peoples' lives were devalued. This devaluation of Muslim life would, in turn, have enormous consequences on Manitoban and Canadian Muslims. Oh, it's horrible when you miss the slide, eh? All right, section 3. Winnipeg Muslims' affective bonds to the Ummah. In the aftermath of September 11th, North American Muslim leaders often praised Canada and the US for the freedoms these states granted their citizens. They recognized that many of their home countries did not give them these freedoms. But nonetheless, Muslim histories and self-conceptions were more complicated than those that posited divides between us and them, between civilized and savage, and between the free and the tyrannized. If the Muslim world, in quotations, lacked in wealth, opportunity, and political justice, it was nonetheless the land where many Muslims located their sisters and brothers in faith. As Irina Grewal points out, Muslim majority lands were part of Muslims' moral geography, giving sense to who they were. To many North American Muslims, the casualties of the War on Terror were not faceless and nameless masses for whom they had little affinity. Rather, they had deep affective bonds to these people. For many, those lives should not have been sacrificed to protect or spread civilization. Ultimately, the value of brotherhood and sisterhood, in Arabic ukhuwa, would alienate many Canadian Muslims from the War on Terror. This international solidarity is evident when we look more closely to the Winnipeg Muslim community's religious practices and political mobilization during this time period. One episode from 2005 highlights many Winnipeg Muslims' visceral concern for their sisters and brothers worldwide. In April, the Muslim Student Association of the University of Manitoba invited Abdurrahim Green, a white British convert belonging to the Salafi movement of Islam, to headline a conference at the University of Manitoba. Green spoke on a series of topics that weekend, including Muslim identity, marriage in Islam, and how to call people to the Islamic faith. The conference spanned from Friday evening through to late Sunday afternoon. What concerns us here is a Saturday evening lecture from 7:15 to 8:30 p.m. Green took his place at the front of the large hall within the Student Union building. The attendees were in good spirits and somewhat sedate, having just filled their stomachs with a delicious meal. The lecture topic was the Forgotten Brothers and Sisters, Chechnya. Though most of the audience would not have had Chechen friends, they knew more about Chechnya than the average Canadian. Many knew Chechens were Muslims, and many knew that they had sought their independence from Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Many also knew the Russian military asserted its control over the region through indiscriminate bombing. Green then began his lecture. If the audience knew something of Chechnya and cared about the plight of its people, Green's lecture was nonetheless there to remind them that they knew and did too little. Quite rightly, Green stated, we remember Palestine, Kashmir, Iraq, Darfur. But how about Chechnya? It is genocide on our doorstep, but no one seems to care. Green spoke about the history of the Chechens as proud Muslims who contributed to Islamic scholarship and resisted Russian imperialism. In 1944, Stalin deported the entire Chechen population, Green said. He deported them to Siberia. It is said that a third of the Chechen population died. The Red Army, when they were taking the Chechens from the mountains, the people who were too old or too young to be taken into the cattle trucks were simply thrown off the cliffs into the ravines. Whole villages of people were summarily executed in that manner. Green then detailed the violence of the contemporary Russian troops, who he claimed killed over 250,000 Chechens in the past decade. He concluded by censuring Muslims for only being concerned about the political events on their TV screens or those that concern their own ethnic group. My research suggests that a pervasive feature of North American Muslim community life was the constant concern with the suffering of the Ummah, what I call ummatic solidarity. In her recent monograph, Tahsin Shims defines the Ummah as the imagined worldwide community of Muslims that transcends borders and connects all Muslims via shared beliefs, rituals, duties, and a sense of membership. A religious framework of this sort, says Shams, can evoke a sense of community and collective identity that people can then use to make sense of their world and relationships, to create group boundaries between an us and a them that transcend state borders. Jamil Aydin has added historical specificity to the modern construction of the Ummah by tracing it to Ottoman attempts to create a pan-Islamic coalition in the face of 19th century European imperialism. Aydin shows that the concept of the Ummah is as historically rich as that of the West. But the Ummah in the North American context is not simply an imagined community in the sense that Benedict Anderson used the term to speak of the nation. It is not simply a community premised on shared identity markers like common beliefs or rituals. Instead, it should be understood as a community of mutual care that demands and is constructed through ethical practices, instructing its members to love their brothers and sisters in faith. For North American Muslims, deploying the concept of the Ummah became the way to shape one's relationship to the Muslim East, the place where most Muslims lived, where Islam originated, and from where many had immigrated. The discourse assumed a deep and enduring relationship between North American Muslims and their wider global community. By the time Green delivered his speech, a set of assumptions about the proper degree of love and concern one should cultivate for an international Muslim community have been developing among Winnipeg Muslims for some decades. The concept of love for the Ummah constantly figured within Friday sermons and community lectures. It appears too in the scriptural sources that often inspired sermon topics and substantiated orators' claims. The popularly invoked collection 40 Hadiths, compiled by the 13th century Syrian scholar Abu Sharaf al-Nawawi, is replete with statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad about the necessity of Muslims loving, caring, and defending each other. For instance, An-Nawawi relates a hadith, a tradition, in which Muhammad states, "None of you truly believes until she loves for his brother, none of you truly believes until she loves for her brother or sister what she loves for herself." Although grammatically gendered, the hadith was understood as applying to both men and women. Quoted often, it is meant to impart upon a Muslim an empathy for his fellow worshipper. If she hates poverty, hunger, or pain for herself, she must also hate it for her brother and sister. Conversely, if she loves wealth, food, shelter, and happiness for herself, then she must wish the same for her sister or brother. By extending feelings of empathy, those using the hadith often sought to galvanize Muslim masses into action. It could thus be employed in charity or disaster relief efforts organized by mosques. And like with Green's speech, it could be used when one needed to encourage action aimed at those outside of one's natural circle of concern, i.e., those who were not one's family, friends, ethnic group, or local community. For instance, the notion of brotherhood and sisterhood motivated 3 separate Winnipeg Muslim bodies to organize fundraising initiatives for the 2005 tsunami that hurt many of their brethren in faith in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Supplementing the concept of love was the concept of rights. The Prophet had articulated that Muslims owed each other God-given rights, saying that, quote, "The entirety of the Muslim is sacred to another Muslim, his life, his property, and his dignity. Winnipeg Muslim community members often invoke this tradition to cement solidarity and encourage mutual respect between Muslims. But they also invoked it to explain the need to respond to the violation of Muslim rights abroad. Examples in the 1980s and 90s included the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Bosnian Civil War, the occupation of the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza, and the Indian occupation of Kashmir. All these were instances before 9/11, where Muslim sisterhood and brotherhood meant caring about defending Muslims' lives, property, and dignity. The overriding metaphor for the Muslim Ummah was one that Green himself invoked in speaking about Chechnya. The Muslim nation is as one body. This image came from an often quoted hadith in which the Prophet reportedly stated, "When part of the body suffers, the entire body feels its pain." The imagery is striking, and the takeaway is clear. Muslims have an unmitigated duty to alleviate the suffering of their brothers and sisters abroad, regardless of whether they have met or will ever meet them. Likewise, it doesn't matter whether they share a language or race. Their rights are God-given and must be upheld. Love and care for the Ummah was not simply talk. Rather, it was an aspiration. And as such, it conformed to what several anthropologists of Islam have termed Muslim self-cultivation. Self-cultivation uses disciplinary practices that eventually equip the self with deep dispositions, proclivities, and sensibilities, what is often encapsulated in the Aristotelian ethical tradition by the term habitus. Fraternal love, like piety or reliance on God, becomes a goal to achieve. We see this in Green's exhortation to Muslims to care more about Chechnya. The means of cultivating this love were many. One was constant exhortation, like Green's. Another was through collective prayer, typically during Friday prayers, where the one giving the sermon asked God to relieve the plight of Muslims suffering calamities. Another was through rallies. Crucially, Canadian Muslims' privileged position as citizens of an affluent and influential country impelled them to do what they could to change policies that harmed Muslims abroad. A concrete example was a February 2001 conference organized in collaboration with the Canadian Mennonite community, with the Manitoba Mennonite community, about the harm caused by the sanctions on Iraq after the first Gulf War. The conference aimed at highlighting a decade of lost life and suffering for the Iraqi people. It was meant to show how policies designed to prevent Saddam Hussein from developing dangerous military capacities had impacted the Iraqi population instead. Children were a focus. The UN estimated that over 1 million Iraqi children had needlessly died because of sanctions imposed on the country, including a ban on importing basic medicinal products, having led to children dying of illnesses that were otherwise easily curable. Muslim community members sought to change public perceptions and state policies by raising awareness of Iraqi children's plight. All this was part of manifesting love and care for one's brothers and sisters of the worldwide Ummah. Section 4, thinking about solidarity and human rights, what Muslims have to teach us. The notion of sisterhood and brotherhood in Islam can be jarring for its exclusivism. Certainly, several scriptural sources in the Islamic tradition support dignity and rights for all humans, regardless of religious affiliation. But among my Winnipeg interlocutors, the emphasis on the Muslim sister brother in many prominently used texts, like in Nawawi's, inevitably placed love and concern for the non-Muslim on a lower rung. Such particularism runs up against a post-Enlightenment tradition that speaks of human rights for all. However, there are 3 points to note if we are to appreciate the contrast between these two discourses fully. For one, the human in human rights has never actually been generalizable. It has historically been the white, cisgender male, heterosexual property owner. Others have had difficulty having their rights recognized without political mobilization. Moreover, as Arendt has pointed out, humans have rarely seen these rights enforced without the protection of a state. In contrast, the discourse of the Ummah in North America was specifically aimed at helping humans of foreign nationalities. Within this discourse, guaranteeing the rights of foreigners depended upon affective ties cultivated on an ongoing basis rather than reliance on the legal recognition of the state. Second, my Winnipeg Muslim participants often saw their role not as caring for their own, but as caring for humans neglected by the world community, a euphemism for states with military and economic power. This view is what prompted a well-known Winnipeg community leader to quote the Egyptian scholar Mohammed el-Ghazali during one of his Friday sermons, quote, "The cheapest blood on earth, on planet Earth today, is the blood of a Muslim." The community leader's point was to highlight how Muslim suffering is rarely the focus of media or political attention, as in the cases of Chechens, the Iraqi children suffering under sanctions, or the Uruzgan wedding bombing. The trend of focusing on neglected populations has continued more recently, with the Winnipeg community sharing news of the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar much earlier and with much more sustained attention than the Western media. For many, caring about the Ummah overlapped with the discourse of human rights by seeking to make these rights a reality for those deprived of them. In short, despite its limitations, the notion of sister and brotherhood among the Muslim community could do what human rights discourse had hitherto not: generate concern and mobilize action to support a sizable population from the formerly colonized world. Here we have a passage of the annual statement of the Manitoba Islamic Association president in the months prior to 9/11, reminding Muslims about forgotten communities. Here's another picture from the Manitoba Muslim, evoking Winnipeg Muslims' emotions over the Israeli army's killing of a young Gazan baby during the Second Intifada. Third, Ummadic solidarity became the basis for creating allyships across religious divides. I've already given the example of the Mennonite community that mobilized against US-imposed sanctions on 1990's Iraq, and the example of the No War Coalition protesting the continued occupation of Iraq. But we could present many others. As this photo from a Manitoba Muslim article published in the weeks after 9/11 shows, Winnipeg Muslim students protested the invasion of Afghanistan under the umbrella of the Canadian Federation of Students. The same article acknowledges several individuals and groups for reaching out and supporting the Muslim community in the weeks after 9/11. Included is an Indigenous elder, representatives of several Christian churches, including the United Church, the Mennonite community, the Unitarian Church, the St. James Parish, the Jewish community, and several unions, such as the National Labor Union. Ummadic solidarity should be seen as having laid the ground for those Muslims who have supported various political causes in our city, such as anti-Indigenous and such as combating anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. Despite the political merits of Ummadic solidarity, care for the Ummah has also at times flattened out political complexity. Conflicts around the globe followed a typical script within the Winnipeg Muslim community. Muslims were suffering and their antagonists were at fault. Often this narrative offered an important counterpoint to what could be found in the Western public sphere. In the example of sanctions in Iraq, it diverged from the narrative that Saddam Hussein's military capacities needed to be stopped at all costs, asking instead if it was right for 1 million children to die as a result. But it could also prevent constructive dialogue on a politically fraught issue. This became all too apparent in global flashpoints that involved two Muslim parties. For instance, it was rare for Muslims to speak up for the rights of Kurds, whose antagonists were other Muslim-majority countries, Turkey and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. During the early years of the War on Terror, Darfur was perhaps the prime example of this discomfort with intra-Muslim strife. News of the Darfur genocide became prominent in Western media in the summer of 2004. 2 years later, the director of the Islamic Social Services Association here in Winnipeg chastised her fellow Winnipeg Muslims for staying conspicuously silent during the conflict. She intimated that race might have something to do with it, since the government sponsoring the Darfur genocide comprised an Arab Sudanese leadership. In advertising a pro-Darfur march, she wrote to the community, quote, "Can someone please take the lead in informing people that Islam does not condone the Darfur genocide? There is no place for racism in Islam, and we cannot be divided across racial lines." These cases highlight the simplistic nature of Muslim solidarity and the lack of political nuance in Muslims' many conversations around politics. A second political drawback of Ummadic solidarity was that it led to violent political mobilization among a small number of Canadian Muslims. We have here a picture of Muhannad al-Farah, a University of Manitoba student who joined Al-Qaeda in 2007 after becoming convinced it was his religious duty to defend Muslims abroad. The picture is from al-Farah's 2017 trial. The analysis of why al-Farah and 2 other U of M students left Winnipeg to join Al-Qaeda is at the heart of my forthcoming book. In my concluding remarks, I wish to tie the relevance of my presentation to the current crisis in Gaza. In this talk, I've attempted to excavate the reasons for Muslim anti-war mobilization in the 5 or 6 years after 9/11. In doing so, I have sought to make 3 contributions to different bodies of literature. First, I've sought to show that the US and Canadian states' use of Islamophobia First, I have sought to show that the US and Canadian states use Islamophobia to help define the contours of the nation in times of war and render palatable to their populations the taking of life abroad. We can see how this is the case in the recent destruction of Gaza. Politicians, police departments, and security agencies have associated Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim cultural symbols with Hamas, the result being the justification for the loss of Gazan life and the increased insecurity of Muslims here. Second, I have sought to show that the Ummah is an aspirational entity brought into existence through practices of mutual care. The notion of the Ummah allows us to see how different Muslim politics depend upon the embodied sensibilities of Muslims about their brothers and sisters in faith. It explains why so many Muslims across Canada are devastated when watching news of Gaza, and then why they feel impelled to speak out. Lastly, I have made the point that Ummadic solidarity may offer us insights about preserving human rights in the absence of a strong state willing to do so. In a moment when Gazans' human rights appear meaningless, Omadic solidarity reminds the world that Palestinian lives matter. They deserve security, access to water, food, medicine, shelter, and individual and political freedom. They are destitute and murdered daily, but they are not forgotten. In short, Omadic solidarity teaches us that upholding human rights across national boundaries depends upon the active cultivation of care for peoples that are distant and unknown to us. I'm grateful to my interlocutors within the Winnipeg Muslim community for teaching me this lesson. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
I want to thank Dr. Soufi for a really powerful example of what careful and critical scholarship can do for how we think of the local, how we think of the global, and how we think of the possibilities and the importance of solidarity in times that are easy, but more so in times that are hard.